Mary Ann Cotton was a British serial killer in the 19th century. Employing poison, she is suspected of murdering up to 21 people. She was the most prolific British serial killer before Harold Shipman. Her motive was gain, as she would marry, kill and collect the insurance money, then repeat it again. In 1871, 40-year-old Mary Ann Cotton, and her husband, 39-year-old Frederick, moved into a home in County Durham, with his 2 stepsons and a 7-month-old baby. 2 months later Frederick died of fever, and one of Mary's lovers, Joseph Nattrass, moved in. In the space of a month, the baby, Nattrass, and Frederick's son all died in the house. On the July 12, 1872, the other son of Frederick died too. All the deaths caused suspicion and a neighbor went to the police. A post-mortem was carried out on the stepson and it revealed him to be poisoned with arsenic. The bodies of the other dead were exhumed and they showed that arsenic was the cause of death. Mary was arrested and charged with the murder of her stepson. She went to trial in March 1873, claiming that they were accidentally killed by arsenic contained in wallpaper, but the prosecution had evidence that she had purchased arsenic. Mary Ann Cotton was found guilty and sentenced to death. She was hanged in Durham Prison, on March 24, 1873. Marie Fikackova was a Czech serial killer. She worked as a nurse. On February 27, 1960, Fikackova was arrested at the maternity ward of the Suzas District Hospital. 2 newborn girls died while she was on duty 4 days earlier. The autopsy proved that a serious brain injury was the cause of death of the 2 babies. One of them had even broken arms. During investigation she confessed to killing at least 11 newborn babies since 1957. She beat her victims around the head, causing them to die within hours or days. The motive for the murders was never fully explained. Before the court, Fikackova was charged with only 2 murders, as it was not possible to prove the older killings. Marie Fikackova was sentenced to death, and executed by hanging, in Pankrak Prison, Czech Republic. Nannie Doss was an American serial killer responsible for the deaths of 11 people, between 1920 and 1954. On the outside, Doss was a friendly and happy neighbor, wife, and parent. On the inside she was a cold-blooded murderess who nearly wiped out her entire family. Her first victims were her own children. Her first husband, George Fraser, arrived home one day in 1920, and found the kids lying on the kitchen floor, dead. Doss claimed it had been an accidental poisoning, but evidently Fraser was not convinced. He left the same day and never went back. Relatives and husbands continued to die of stomach problems and others, until Doss' 5th husband, Samuel Doss, suddenly passed away. The doctor in the case was not as gullible as the previous ones were, and didn't simply take Doss at her word. He ordered an autopsy be done, which revealed massive doses of arsenic in the man's system. The bodies of Doss' husbands, relatives, and children were exhumed and tested. It was found that Doss' 2 infant children, 4 of her husbands, 2 of her sisters, her mother, and a nephew, had all been killed by arsenic poisoning. Armed with this information, police soon convinced the poisoner to confess, and she was sent to prison for life in 1964. She succumbed to leukemia the following year. Dagmar Overby was a Danish serial killer. During a 7-year period she murdered 25 children, of which 1 was her own. On March 3, 1921, she was sentenced to death in one of the most talked-about trials in Danish history, that changed legislation on child care. The sentence was later commuted to life in prison. Overby was working as a professional child caretaker, caring for babies born outside of marriage, murdering her own charges. She strangled them, drowned them or burned them to death in her masonry heater. The corpses were either cremated, buried or hidden in the loft. Overby was convicted of 9 murders, as there were no proof of the others. Her lawyer based the case on Overby being abused herself as a baby, but that did not impress the judge. She became one of the 3 women sentenced to death in Denmark in the 20th century, but she, like the other 2, was reprieved. She died in prison on May 6, 1929, at age 42. Notes relating to her case are included in the Politihistorisk Museum, Museum of Police History, in Nørrebro, Copenhagen. Rosemary Pauline West is a British serial killer, now an inmate at HM Prison, Low Newton, after being convicted of 10 murders in 1995. Her husband Fred, who committed suicide in prison while awaiting trial, is believed to have collaborated with her in the torture and murder of at least 10 young women, many at the couple's home at 25 Cromwell Street, Gloucester, England. The crimes for which Rosemary West was convicted occurred mainly between April 1973 and August 1979. She murdered Charmaine West, the daughter of Fred's previous wife Rena, in June 1971, and buried her in their previous home of 25 Midland Road, while Fred West was serving a prison sentence for petty theft. One of the bodies found at 25 Cromwell Street was that of their daughter, Heather, who was murdered by Fred in June 1987 at the age of 16, after being abused by Rosemary, while Fred raped her. The Wests told friends and concerned parties that Heather had gone away to work at a holiday village. This was the last known murder that the pair committed. Although she did not confess, the circumstantial evidence against Rosemary West was overwhelming. She went on trial in October 1995, 9 months after her husband's suicide. He had hanged himself in Winson Green Prison with a knotted bedsheet, on January 1 of that year, despite being on suicide watch. The jury was unanimous. On November 22, 1995, West was found guilty of 10 murders. The judge, Mr. Justice Mantell, sentenced her to life imprisonment, saying, "If attention is paid to what I think, you will never be released." This was only the second instance, in modern times, of a British woman being condemned to die in prison. The other was serial killer Myra Hindley, who died in 2002. Rosemary West was held at the same prison as Hindley. Subsequently, serial killer Joanna Dennehy became the third to receive a whole-life tariff. Catherine Margaret Birnie is a serial killer from Perth, Australia. In the 1980s, along with David John Birnie, they murdered 4 women in their home and attempted to murder a 5th. Their victims ranging in age from 15 to 31. These crimes were referred to in the press as the Moorhouse murders, after the Birnie's address at 3 Moorhouse Street in Willagee, a suburb of Perth, Western Australia. David Birnie was found dead in his cell at Casuarina Prison, on October 7, 2005. He had committed suicide by hanging. He was due to appear in court for the rape of a fellow prisoner the next day. After being found sane to stand trial, Catherine Birnie was sentenced to 4 sentences of life imprisonment by the Supreme Court of Western Australia. Under law at the time, she's required to serve 20 years before being eligible for parole. Catherine Birnie is imprisoned in Bandy Up Women's Prison, where she was formerly the head librarian. She was barred from attending David's funeral. An application for parole in 2007 was rejected, and her release is unlikely to ever happen. Amelia Elizabeth Dyer was one of the most prolific serial killers in history, murdering infants in her care over a 20-year period, in Victorian Britain. She was tried and hanged for one murder, but there is little doubt she was responsible for many more similar deaths, possibly 400 or more. Marie Delphine LaLaurie, more commonly known as Madame LaLaurie, was a Louisiana-born socialite and serial killer, known for her involvement in the torture and murder of black slaves. Born during the Spanish colonial period, Marie married 3 times over the course of her life. She maintained a prominent position in the social circles of New Orleans until April 10, 1834. That day, rescuers responding to a fire at her Royal Street mansion, discovered bound slaves within the house, who showed evidence of torture over a long period. LaLaurie's house was subsequently sacked by an outraged mob of New Orleans citizens, and it is thought that she fled to Paris, where she died due to a boar attack during a hunting accident. As of 2012, the Royal Street mansion where Marie LaLaurie lived, is still standing and is a prominent New Orleans reference. Margie Velma Barfield was an American serial killer, convicted of 1 murder, but she eventually confessed to 6 murders. After 2 marriages ended, with the death of her husbands, by 1977 Barfield was in a relationship with Stuart Taylor, who was a widower and a tobacco farmer. As she had been doing for years, she forged checks on Taylor's account, to pay for her addiction to prescription drugs. Fearing that she had been found out, she mixed arsenic rat poison into his beer. Taylor became very ill, and Velma volunteered to nurse him. As his condition worsened, she took him to hospital where he died a few days later. Unfortunately for her, there was an autopsy, which found that the cause of Taylor's death was arsenic poisoning, and Velma was arrested and charged with his murder. At the trial her defense pleaded insanity, but this was not accepted, and she was convicted. The jury recommended the death sentence. Velma appeared cold and uncaring on the stand, and actually gave the district attorney a round of applause, when he made his closing speech. Barfield later confessed to the 1974 murder of her own mother and of 2 elderly people, John Henry Lee, and Dolly Edwards, a relative of Stuart Taylor. Barfield gained notoriety as the death row granny, becoming the first woman to be executed in the U.S. since 1962, and the first since the reinstatement of the death penalty in 1976. She was also the first woman to be executed by lethal injection. Leonarda Cianciulli, was an Italian serial killer, better known as the soap maker of Correggio. In 1939, Cianciulli heard that her eldest son, Giuseppe, was going to join the Italian army in preparation for World War II. Giuseppe was her favorite child, and she was determined to protect him at all costs. She decided that his safety required human sacrifices. She found her victims in 3 middle-aged women, all neighbors. Sources record that Leonarda was something of a fortune teller herself, and that these women all visited her for help. She murdered the 3 women between 1939 and 1940, and turned their bodies into soap and tea cakes. A number of artifacts from the case, including the pot in which the victims were boiled, are on display at the Criminological Museum in Rome. Police in Reggio Emilia opened an investigation and soon arrested Cianciulli. At trial she confessed everything, was found guilty of her crimes and sentenced to 30 years in prison and 3 years in a criminal asylum. Known as the Moors murderer, and the most evil woman in Britain, Myra Hindley and her lover, Ian Brady, plotted and carried out the rape and deaths of 5 young children between 1963 and 1965, in and around what is now Greater Manchester, England. The victims were all buried on Saddleworth Moor. On October 6, 1965, Hindley's 17-year-old brother-in-law, David Smith, tipped her off to the police. Smith had witnessed Ian Brady killing 17-year-old Edward Evans with an axe, concealing his horror for fear of meeting a similar fate. On October 11, Hindley was charged as an accessory to the murder of Edward Evans and was arrested. She pleaded not guilty to all of the murders. Myra was found guilty of 3 murders, and was jailed for life. She was never released, and died in prison in 2002. Dorothea Puente ran a boarding house for the elderly in Sacramento, California in the 1980s, before it was discovered she was skimming money from her boarders' benefit checks and burying them in her backyard when they died from, she said, to be natural causes. Police didn't believe her, and she went on trial in 1992. Puente received life without the possibility of parole. She died in prison in 2011 at age 82. Genene Jones is a former pediatric nurse, who killed somewhere between 1 and 46 infants and children in her care. Working at several medical clinics in and around San Antonio, Texas, Nurse Genene Jones practiced possibly the most heinous life and death games in American history, injecting innumerable babies with life-threatening drugs. Jones seemed to thrill in putting the small children in mortal peril and thrusting herself into the role of hero when the children pulled through. Unfortunately, many did not. She was sentenced to 99 years in prison on February 1984 and to a concurrent term of 60 years in prison on October of the same year. Aileen Wuornos was an American serial killer, who killed 7 men in Florida, USA, between 1989 and 1990. Wuornos claimed that her victims had either raped or attempted to rape her, while she was working as a prostitute, and that all of the homicides were committed in self-defense. She was convicted and sentenced to death for 6 of the murders and was executed by lethal injection, on October 9, 2002. Myra Hindley reportedly confessed to poisoning 35 individuals, including her 2 husbands, multiple lovers, and her son, with arsenic, during the 1920s. After the wife of one of Hindley's lovers followed him to her residence one evening, and the man subsequently never returned home, the police were called to investigate his disappearance. Upon searching Hindley's wine cellar, they discovered 32 unburied, zinc-lined coffins. Each contained a male corpse in varying stages of decomposition. Hindley was arrested and taken into police custody, where she confessed to having poisoned the 32 men with arsenic, when she suspected they had been unfaithful to her. Jane Toppan was an American serial killer. Toppan was a nurse with no conscience. During her residency, she used her patients as guinea pigs in experiments with morphine and atropine. She would alter their prescribed dosages to see what it did to their nervous systems. She began her killing poisoning spree in 1895 by killing her landlords. In 1899, she killed her foster sister Elizabeth with a dose of strychnine. By 1902, she had confessed to 31 murders. On June 23 she was found not guilty by reason of insanity, and committed for life in the Taunton Insane Hospital. Marybeth Tinning is an American prisoner serving a sentence of 20 years to life, after being convicted of the murder of her 9th child, Tammy Lynn. Though she confessed to also killing 2 of her sons, she is suspected in the death of all 8 of her other children, who originally had been thought to have died of natural causes. All of Tinning's children died before their 5th birthday. All were smothered with a pillow. Marybeth Tinning supposedly suffered from Munchausen syndrome, a psychiatric disorder wherein those affected feign disease, illness, or psychological trauma to draw attention or sympathy to themselves, although at the time the disease was unknown. She also admitted that she had been slowly poisoning her husband. He survived and later supported her at her trial. She's incarcerated at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility for Women in Bedford Hills, New York. Juana Barraza is a Mexican professional wrestler and serial killer, dubbed the Old Lady Killer. The first murder attributed to Barraza has been dated to the late 1990s, and to a specific killing on November 17, 2003. The authorities and the press have given various estimates as to the total number of the killer's victims, with totals ranging from 24 to 49 deaths. Motivated by a lingering resentment against her mother, she robbed and strangled all her victims, who were between 64 and 79 years old. She was sentenced to 759 years in jail for 11 murders. Elizabeth Bathory was a countess and serial killer from the Bathory family of nobility, in the Kingdom of Hungary. She has been labeled by the Guinness World Records as the most prolific female murderer, though the precise number of her victims is debated. Bathory and 4 collaborators were accused of torturing and killing hundreds of young women, between 1585 and 1610. The highest number of victims cited during Bathory's trial was 650. Despite the evidence against Elizabeth, her family's influence kept her from facing trial. She was imprisoned in December 1610 within Ksecht Castle, Upper Hungary, now in Slovakia. There, she remained imprisoned in a set of rooms until her death, 4 years later.